Evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talk series. My name is Claire Haley. I'm the Vice President of Author Talks and Democracy Initiatives here at the History Center. It's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this virtual Author Talk featuring author Paul Kix. He is joining us to talk about his new book, You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Begin to Live. 10 Weeks in Birmingham That Changed America. The book is out and is available for purchase from Atlanta History Center's online museum store. I'll post a link about how to do that in the chat here in a second, or from your chosen bookstore retailer, but we really appreciate your purchase from Atlanta History Center tonight. We offer in-store pickup or shipping, so we'll get that book to you. I really encourage you to pick it up. Not only is tonight's conversation going to be interesting, but I can guarantee we will not be able to get to nearly the surface of what's in this book, and you will want to know more after tonight. As we talk this evening, we are going to close the chat, but we will have the Q&A open. So if you have questions that you would like to ask Paul as we converse, please drop those in the Q&A. We will get to as many of those as possible at the end of our time this evening. Now, to briefly introduce tonight's author, and then we will get started on the conversation. Paul Kix is an author and writer whose last book was The Saboteur, a best-selling and critically acclaimed true story of the most daring man in World War II. He's a journalist, and his writing has appeared in multiple publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, GQ, and ESPN The Magazine. He lives in Connecticut with his family, from which he's joining us tonight. Thanks so much for being with us here in Atlanta, Paul. We really appreciate it.
I love it. Thanks for having me. This is great.
So, to those who are entering the story with a lot of familiarity, or even those who are entering the story with no familiarity at all, I think what is very striking about your book is right from the beginning, looking at the description of Birmingham, what Birmingham was actually like during this time, during the 1960s, and why it was such a crucial but frightening and seemingly impossible target for the SCLC. So just to set the stage tonight, would you mind telling us more about what Birmingham was like in the early 1960s and why it caused such a stir as a location for the SCLC's campaign in 1963?
Yeah, so we forget this today. I think even those who know the civil rights movement somewhat well, we forget that Birmingham was far and away the worst, most violent, most racist city in America. This was a place where the Klan castrated Black men as a way to intimidate Martin Luther King and his allies from entering Birmingham. This was a place where the police raped Black women in their patrol cars. Just prior to King and the SCLC's involvement in Birmingham, Edward R. Murrow went to Birmingham for CBS, and he filed a report from there. And as he did so, toward the end of his stay, he turned to his producer and he said, "I have not seen any place like this since Nazi Germany." So that was Birmingham, Alabama, in the year of our Lord, 1963. And I found that setting to be fascinating as a journalist and author and historian, because the stakes could not have been higher for the SCLC. And the thing about that is that it wasn't like the SCLC had gone from success to success. They had had 7 years of pretty much abject failure. Yes, they had succeeded via the Supreme Court's help with Montgomery bus boycott. However, by 1963, there were journalists at the time who in going through Montgomery were interviewing various people and found that basically because of the intransigence of the Klan and sort of the intransigence as well of the Alabama government, Black people had returned to sitting in the back of the bus. So for 7 years, from basically 55 to 8 years, effectively, from 55, 56 to 62, 63, everything the SCLC tried to do, they failed at. They were sneered at by not just the Southern press, but the Northern press, the New York Herald Tribune, among other liberal papers back then, who thought that King was sort of like a guy who was all talk, no walk. I mean, this was something that even other civil rights groups considered. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis's group. John Lewis was very young then, and there were members within his organization who telegrammed King and said, "You are a phony." They called him DeLawd, which was, a sort of play off a euphemism for how pompous he was in his dress and in his speech, and how, again, like, he would do all the talking and he was expecting everybody else to do all the walking. And they just thought, this guy's a joke. The SCLC shouldn't even be around. And so they decided to go to Birmingham, the SCLC, as almost a last ditch attempt to either break segregation or be broken by it. And in so doing, they also realized that if we fail in Birmingham, we will very likely fail as an organization. And if we fail as an organization, there is a chance that the civil rights movement as a whole may fail. So the stakes, wow, they could not have been higher in 1963.
And I want to get into a little bit of what you talked about a little later in the conversation, just about the differences between, I think sometimes now looking back, we forget that the civil rights movement was far from a monolith. There were so many different organizations, so many different ideas about how to go about doing what they needed to do. And not everyone was right, not everyone was wrong, right? And there were successes and failures. I mean, right before this campaign, you had a failure of epic proportions in Albany, Georgia.
Yeah.
Which is just, that's the ghost that kind of haunts Martin Luther King and his advisors. This entire book really is that constant refrain of, we can't make this another Albany.
Can't be another Albany. Yeah. Albany was a total failure. And I like as well what you're saying there, Claire, about it not being monolithic, because one thing that fascinated me about these guys, and by these guys, I mean King, and really the book focuses on three of his deputies. It's James Bevill, who had a somewhat redundant title, the Director of Direct Action. That basically meant he was the operations lead for the SCLC. Then there was Wyatt Walker, another Atlantan, and he was the executive director of the SCLC at the time. And then there was Fred Shuttlesworth, and he was the lone Birminghamian within the sort of higher, the executive suite of the SCLC, organizing this campaign. The thing about those four guys in particular, they had massive egos. I mean, massive egos. And there's this joke that I put in the book that's like, they all found a way to kneel before God, but my God, they could still stand mighty tall before each other. And like, that was the reality. Like just for instance, Wyatt Walker was a very officious leader. James Bevill wanted to basically run things himself. Wyatt Walker and James Bevill hated each other. What made that hatred all the more ironic, I guess, is that Wyatt Walker was the guy who like had the vision, and James Bevill had to be the guy who manifested the vision. So these two people needed to get along, and they pretty much hated each other. Let's look at King and Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth, literally a hog farmer from poorest, like most rural Alabama before moving to Birmingham. King, because of who his father was and the success of Ebenezer Baptist, by the time he's growing up in a sort of upper echelon of high-class Black society. And his upbringing and sort of social standing and socioeconomic standing could not be more diametrically opposed to Fred Shuttlesworth. These two people had to get along and see each other eye to eye, and they did not. And you see this sort of infighting throughout the book. It actually becomes one of the major themes of the book as well. That was so fascinating to me, because when you watch, say, a PBS documentary or something else, and I have nothing against PBS documentaries about the civil rights movement, everything seems as not only as if it's monolithic, but as if it's preordained, right? Like these guys got along, and then this success happened, and this success happened, this success happens. It's like, and if I can say this, like, that's bullshit, man. Like that was not the case in 1963. They were constantly infighting with each other. That was part of the reason that Albany fell apart. Birmingham, and we can get to this in a minute, very nearly fell apart early on because of the egos that were clashing. And I say this not as a way to diminish them, but as a way to actually lift them up. Because like, I want people to realize that they were fully flawed, which meant they were fully human, which meant that the battles they waged were in some ways similar to those that we have to fight in our own lives. Yes, it's a civil rights movement, and it is sort of an outsized competition and fight for one's life. But the sort of inner conflict that we have today in our own offices or just between neighbors, like they were dealing with all of that too. I wanted to make them human so that we could make them in some way relatable.
I love that, because by being human too, it really underscores the fact that they bought into this movement with so much, personal risk to them and their families. And it wasn't like these were necessarily extraordinary. I mean, they were extraordinary people, but they were still people.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they were able to do that, I think, is just really inspiring as you read them. And even when they, the book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it's very narrative driven, very character driven. So you really get to know these people and kind of their personalities and how they are. And sometimes they'll drive you crazy. I'll just be honest with their reasoning for things, but it just really reinforces what this actually took out of the people who put into it for the
It was
civil
a
rights.
total commitment, and it was like it nearly broke them. I mean, and these are men of faith. It nearly broke them spiritually. It certainly nearly broke them emotionally. And they went down there thinking that they were literally going to die. So like physically, they were prepared for death. It was the biggest battle of their lives, and they would say that even years later.
Mm-hmm. And one last observation about that, I did find you'll in some of the rhetoric in the book talks about how all these outside agitators from Atlanta are coming into Birmingham and trying to tell us what to do, which is just a classic Southern dynamic, that continues even to this day in some way. Atlanta going around trying to tell everyone how they should run things. So just really underscored how important Fred Shuttlesworth and then eventually the other folks who really James Bevill's approach to really getting into Birmingham and getting to know the people, so that they weren't coming in as these outside people, raising all this ruckus, so to speak, and causing problems for the people who would still be there when they had to leave. I mean, that was a really real dynamic. So can you talk about so you talk a little bit about the Black community in Birmingham as a whole. There's a very interesting dynamic in Birmingham. Half of the Black community in Birmingham at the time were laborers. Many more had other jobs that meant that they were beholden to white industrialists, white store owners. And so that made it a really hard dynamic in which to protest, right?
Yeah.
Because there was this really real personal risk. So you had Wyatt Walker, who had this idea that we're going to come rolling into Birmingham and everyone is going to be up for this. And that's not really what happened at first. So can you talk about when the SCLC came to Birmingham, even though there were no doubt, civil rights movements happening in Birmingham, people who were obviously wanting to fight for Black equality, they didn't get the reception that they thought that they would get. So what happened when they came into Birmingham?
So just to set the stage a little bit, because you do a great job in that setup. Wyatt Walker had this grand plan for Birmingham, and he had timed like down to the literal second how long it would take a kid to walk from, say, 16th Street Baptist Church to the white downtown where they were hoping to protest at one of the department stores or lunch encounters, and how long to the second it would take like an older Black man to do that. Now, I say that to you only because this was a man who loved a good planning memo and wanted he's like, if I can, and this is again one of those instances in which Albany, Georgia was haunting him. He's like, if I can just plan this really well, we might win. And then there was James Bevill, who was saying, your plans don't mean anything if you can't get the people to come alongside you. And basically, Bevill was right, because what happens is they roll into town, the SCLC. And I mean, like within literally, like when they land at the airport, they are not met by the contingent that they thought, King and Ralph Abernathy and Wyatt Walker are not met by the contingent they thought they would be. This Black Baptist ministers conference, not everybody shows up. So King gets nervous. He's like, so what does this mean? And so he's like, well, what if we go to the conference, like, and go to one of the meetings right now? They're super chilly there. Nobody wants to actually talk to King. Then when they go to A.G. Gaston, who was well on his way to being not only the richest Black man in America, but one of the richest men in America, period. He was an entrepreneur. He owned basically, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but basically, like, he owned almost half of Birmingham, an incredibly, wildly successful success story in a place as segregated and awful as Birmingham. A.G. Gaston is a story into himself, but A.G. Gaston didn't want King in town either. And he was their literal host. He owned the Gaston Motel where King and the rest stayed. And so they're like, what is happening? And basically what is happening is they saw all these guys from Atlanta, and everybody in Birmingham had read all these accounts over the years of how King and the SCLC, they're going to swoop in, they're going to do what they're going to do, and then they're going to leave town. And whatever happens, we're going to have to clean up. And Birminghamians are like, that's not going to work, in large part because almost 50% of Black adults were domestic workers in some ways, right? The rest, and this is an incredibly, again, segregated city and a very oppressive and suppressive one. The rest, if they could be working class, middle class to professional class, they were largely teachers. Very few of them were lawyers. Like, they had to actually fight to argue even in Birmingham courts. Black lawyers did. And basically, to your earlier point, everybody had a boss who was a white person, and primarily a white man, and primarily somebody who did not want any sort of change in Birmingham, which meant that if any of these adults protested alongside King, those adults would lose their jobs. They might protest. King might get what he wanted out of these people, but then he would eventually leave and they would be jobless and now have to raise their families. And that was something that Wyatt Walker had not factored in. And it was something that James Bevill began to see. And this became the biggest problem of the SCLC in the first month of the campaign. The numbers of protesters, of people who were willing to protest alongside the SCLC, shrunk to an almost like anemic level where, so this campaign starts in April of 63. By the end of April, I say this in the book, how there was, the New York Times effectively was like the largest paper covering it. The New York Times even left town because they're like, there's nothing even here to report anymore. And so the wire services remained, and those wire services had stories that were like, 3 people showed up for a protest, they all left amicably, and no one was arrested. And like, that was the extent of what was left of the SCLC's grand plan for Birmingham. And so everyone's like, something has to change. What's wrong? What can we do?
And on the other side of those protesters was someone who, I think everyone knows this name, Bull Connor.
Yeah.
But you really bring him to life in the book, because it's one thing to kind of intellectually know about Bull Connor, and it's another thing to read his words and to really dig into how he conducted himself, and, was just a really bad person. I don't know another way to describe.
No, he was a really bad person. And I think he's also a product of Birmingham in that place and time. And this might be, one of those distinctions between, say, Atlanta and Birmingham. Let's just, since we're at the Atlanta History Center, let's just do a very, very brief bit of history here. So Birmingham is not a part of the Civil War at all, right? It's not even founded until the 1870s. And when it is founded, it's founded by basically Northern financiers with interest in coal and steel, because those raw materials were in these hills in Jefferson County. And so it's founded with the idea of extracting that. So that means that very quickly it becomes a Southern outpost of Northern interest. There is no cotton. There is no tobacco. There is no history of even antebellum history like there is in Atlanta. What happens instead is there is, especially after the Civil War, a serfdom that develops in Birmingham. For more than 80 years, the people who live in Birmingham are very poor whites, or the first generations of freed blacks just trying to scrape any sort of existence they can, right, out of these hills in Jefferson County. It is a place that is wildly violent. It was known as the murder capital of the world in the 1920s and 30s. It was the place that had the highest illiteracy rate in the nation for a long time. And it was also a place where those bosses who worked in the mills and the mines, they didn't live in Birmingham either. They lived in the suburban Mountain Brook. And so here's what happens. If you are a poor white guy and you are not happy with your life, and you see yourself struggling, and you see, and this is the indignity and also the racism of early 20th century Birmingham, you see Black people kind of in the same position as you are. They're kind of like, you're kind of the same social standing as them. Well, you can't lash out at your boss in Mountain Brook, or you might lose your job. And you certainly can't lash out at your boss's boss up in Pittsburgh, or maybe like one of those financiers in Boston or New York. So if you can't lash out at those people, if you're a white person in the early 20th century, the choice was to lash out at Blacks. And the Ku Klux Klan, the Clavern in Birmingham, became the largest in the nation in a matter of years in the early 20th century. I say all that because the hatred of Birmingham was learned. It was learned across generations, and it had nothing to do with your granddaddy losing at Gettysburg. It had everything to do with how you were no better off in the here and now in the early 20th century. And for somebody like Bull Connor, coming of age in that Birmingham, Bull Connor had a very prototypical sort of Birmingham upbringing. He was raised in a broken home. He didn't graduate from high school. The one thing that he figured out was that he had the ability to gab, and he could basically use his ability to talk and pair it with a populism that blamed everything on Black people. And man, that catapulted a political rise where he dominated Birmingham politics for more than a generation. And he did it through hatred, and he did it through violence, and he did it over and over and over again. Corruption. There was no limit to how vile Bull Connor was. But at the same time, the reason I want to discuss all that is because he is very much a product of Birmingham, Alabama in the early 20th century. So I feel like in some ways the people loved Bull because they saw Bull as one of them, excuse me.
That's so interesting because right around the events of the book that you wrote, Bull does run for mayor of Birmingham, but he's not successful, which is very surprising to a lot of people because, as you say, he had been so politically dominant in Birmingham for so long.
Yeah. So when Bull dynamited the car of a political opponent in the 1940s, the people overwhelmingly voted for him anyway. When Bull was indicted by a grand jury, where basically he was said to have run a vice unit within the police department that made other cops basically like petty criminals. They would steal everything. The people reelected him. But when Bull continued, especially after the advent of television, and I mentioned earlier CBS's Edward R. Murrow, when Murrow went down there and showed the nation, this is in 61, 62, some of the violence that Bull could offer, the nation was outraged and appalled. And as a result of that, Birmingham began to lose tourism dollars. Birmingham began to lose industry, and its sort of economic sector shrunk in a matter of years by almost 10%. As a result of that, even though Bull had been, a vile criminal, all the rest, it was only when Birmingham began to lose economically that Birminghamians began to turn against Bull. And that was really the reason that he lost that 1963 campaign.
And part of what was so important to the SCLC and was something they were initially struggling with, and then they eventually succeeded in the end, was controlling that media narrative about Birmingham. I mean, as you say, they didn't have to work too hard to show the brutality that existed in Birmingham. It had already been done for them. But in a lot of ways, even though Bull Connor wasn't the mayor, Bull Connor remained a very visible figure in opposition to the SCLC, both figuratively and literally. Often the description of him just standing out, with his arms crossed on the stairs as all these horrible things are happening. It's just a really striking image. So how did he manage to finagle staying in power to be kind of opposite of them? And how did the SCLC exploit that personality of Bull Connor to really get control of that narrative?
So Bull loses this campaign for mayor. The people of Birmingham basically put in, just prior to this mayoral election, a new mayoral city council form of government. Before it had been county commissioners. And I'll leave the rest of that. I mean, if you want to explore it, some of that's in the book, but it tends to get kind of tedious with respect to like how city governments work. In any case, he loses. So the city government switches over. He loses this mayoral campaign at the outset of the SCLC's own campaign to this guy named Albert Boutwell, who was formerly the lieutenant governor of Alabama. And now Albert Boutwell is the mayor. Well, Bull says, well, under basically the bylaws of the city of Birmingham, I should be able to serve out my term as county commissioner until 1965. This was a ludicrous position because the city had already, the citizens of Birmingham had already said, we want to move to this mayoral city council system. In any case, Bull files this lawsuit saying I should be able to stay in power. This was such a godsend to the SCLC because they were like this is another huge problem for Wyatt Walker. Wyatt Walker's like, I have this 4-act play of increasing escalation that I need to happen. And Bull Connor needs to be this antagonist. And on literally the first day of the SCLC's campaign, Bull loses his mayoral bid, which shocks everybody. And Wyatt Walker's like, what am I going to do if my antagonist is no longer in the play, right? I need my villain. So when he files that lawsuit and it goes through the court system, it basically allows him to stay in power through that spring. And so the SCLC is like, thank God. And so what they do is, and I love this, and this is something else where it's like, I didn't know this until I began to research the book. There is this ongoing psychological, like cat and mouse game between the SCLC and Bull Connor, right? SCLC trying to goad Bull knowing that if he is goaded by the SCLC, like he's going to lose in the eyes of the media. And if he loses in the eyes of the media, he might very well lose Birminghamians. And so he doesn't want to do it. And the SCLC goading him a little bit more and back and forth and back and forth. And there are these optical illusions that Wyatt Walker puts on display that I don't want to necessarily go in here, but it's fascinating all the same. And like King is fully on board with all of these almost like psychological operations, right? And over the course of time, they're like, if we can just get to the point where we can fill the jails and then continue to march, Bull will have no choice but to either accede to our wishes, which is break segregation in the most segregated place in America, or he will lash out with the behavior that we know he has within him. And they're like, we bet that Bull is going to eventually, Bull's true behavior is going to come out. His true colors are going to shine. Mm-hmm. And they're like, we just bet that someday that's going to happen.
And this fits in. I'd love to talk a little bit about the King's philosophy of direct action and nonviolence, because sometimes I think today when we hear, we forget about the direct action piece, kind of in general conversation about civil rights movement. And we forget that though the movement, that King's part of the movement was at its heart nonviolent, that does not mean it was non-confrontational. It was designed to provoke a reaction, as you say, sometimes very extreme, like Bull Connor, but the point was to illustrate the injustice and to illustrate this overwrought reaction that people would have when people are trying to do something as simply as sit at a lunch counter and have a cup of coffee. There's this really interesting passage in the book, and we're jumping over a little bit of the events, but King does end up getting arrested. So he is one of the people who is helping to fill the jail. He was in solitary confinement. He was kept there for several days. And out of it, we get one of the most poignant, eloquent pieces of King's writing, I think, and that's saying something because he had a lot of that. But you really go into detail there about kind of, because the letter from a Birmingham jail, as it became known, pulls from lots of different influences in King's life and his theology that led him towards this development of direct action, nonviolence, and his theory of change about how this could be effective. So can you talk a little bit about King's influences and how that created this idea that fueled the campaign?
Thank you for asking that, because to me, this was like the most fascinating chapter to write, because you see in that letter the whole of King's intellectual trek. It's across 15 years of his life to arrive in that jail in solitary confinement and writing with this little nub of a pencil in the Birmingham jail as he's trying to lay out what he thinks. And I think to answer that question, you need to almost go back to seminary. And King is trying to figure out, as far back as his seminarian days, what sort of Christian should I be and what sort of leader should I be? And he was taken by this idea put forth by this early 20th century theologian, Christian theologian named Walter Rauschenbusch. And Rauschenbusch had this notion that basically better ideas can win out. And so he had a social justice campaign in the early 20th century in Hell's Kitchen in New York, where he basically began to partner with unions that were organizing there in Manhattan. And this social justice movement that came out of it led to shorter work weeks, led to the end of child labor, first in New York and then throughout the rest of the nation. And for a long time, reading about it, about 30 years later in the 1950s, King was so fascinated with Rauschenbusch. He read everybody, like whoever you speak to about King, especially the people who know him. This is, from his wife to somebody like Wyatt Walker, Andrew Young, anybody who was a real intimate of King, they will say he was one of the most intellectually voracious people they had ever encountered. And so he's reading everybody from Kant to Nietzsche to Rousseau to, there's to Aristotle to Plato. Like there's no limit on who he's interested in. But always he's returning to Rauschenbusch until his last year, of seminary, when he reads Reinhold Niebuhr, who is another Christian theologian, another German American. And Niebuhr, he pastored about 20 years after Rauschenbusch in the 1930s. And instead of he pastoring in New York, he was a pastor and theologian in Detroit. And this is around the time that Henry Ford is really building out the factories. And so he's pastoring to all of these immigrants from Europe, and increasingly the early waves of the Great Migration of Black Americans from the South. Everybody's descending on Detroit. And Niebuhr believed in Rauschenbuschian sort of social justice, that superior ideas can win. But ultimately, he had a couple of different experiences where he would go to the foundries and he would go to Henry Ford's plants, and he would see that this sort of work was exploitive. And so he began to think, well, what good is Rauschenbuschian social justice? And this idea fascinated him because it's like, put another way, it's like, what good is a shorter work week? What good is the end of child labor if the work itself remains exploitive? And so to his mind, he began to formulate a more hardened position. And he began to realize that man could be moral in the particular, like any one person could act by God's grace on his own. But if you put that man in a collective, he will be immoral. And he wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And this is in the mid-1930s. And it was an absolute, it shook Christian theology, and it actually became a bestseller. Like it moved into the popular press. And when King read it, the idea behind it is that the only way to take power is to claim it wholly from somebody else. So King thought, well, that seems right, sitting there in the 1950s, because he's like, if you think about even the war that had just ended, it wasn't as if communist Russia and a more capitalistic United States and United Kingdom, it wasn't as if they were united by ideas. They were united by power. They wanted to claim power for themselves and take it from two other nations after taking it from two other nations, defeating them, claim more nations for their own imperialistic gains. That's really what drove the world. And so he began to see, well, I think everything really does tilt on power. So he abandoned all of Rauschenbusch and he moved toward Niebuhr. that was great, but it didn't actually prescribe a solution. Solution then became, well, who believes that, like, how can you fix this if you're the minority? And so that's when we began to read Gandhi. And Gandhi and the Salt March to the Sea in the 1930s, and Gandhi's idea of nonviolent direct action protest. Direct action, to your earlier point, meaning you do something in such a way so that you try to claim the power wholly from some other group. It is confrontational, but Gandhi's insight was it needs to be nonviolent. You need to do it in such a way so that you are never raising your fist against somebody else. And so Gandhi organized by first the hundreds and then tens of thousands and ultimately millions, people who would storm against British authority, be sometimes knocked across the head by colonial rulers. But those colonial rulers also said Gandhi's nonviolence was more sinister than terrorism. And here's what they meant by that. If we level our billy clubs against Indians like Gandhi, we lose our moral authority in India. There were other officers who literally became nauseous trying to beat back the Indians. There were other Brits who were like, I can't believe you're doing this in India. There were other dignitaries in other sort of Western nations who are like, this is not the way you should be responding to try to rule. So beating them back was not the answer. And yet, if they accede to all of Gandhi's wishes, they give up they give up their authority, their ability to govern. So that trek from Rauschenbusch to Niebuhr to Gandhi, that trek influences King as he starts out in a civil rights movement. And that trek is something he begins to realize himself in his own civil rights campaigns. And by the time of 1963, when there are other white liberal pastors, theologians, rabbis, members of the press who are saying, you know what, maybe you shouldn't provoke Bull Connor this way. King sees an almost Rauschenbuschian argument that, well, this is just these people trying to say that better ideas will win, when the reality is you only get power by claiming it wholly from somebody else. And the only way you can do that and keep it for yourself is if it's nonviolent. And really, the whole of that Birmingham campaign, and specifically the whole of that soaring piece of rhetoric that is the letter from Birmingham jail, which I think is honestly the greatest document in really the whole of America. I think it's, you know, it sums up mankind and our struggle and our fight for justice. To my mind, this may seem like anathema, but like better than the Declaration of Independence, better than Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. You know, in many ways, and I argue this in the book, that like, I really think that 1963 is America's origin story. Because I don't think it's 1776. Because 1776, you know, Claire, you wouldn't have had the ability to vote. 1863, yes, it means freedom. But then what happens after that is, during Reconstruction, is Jim Crow and 100 years of segregation and lynching and violence that in ways that are just, in some sense, slavery by another name, right? 1963 is what happens in that spring is really our founding as a nation in some way. And the letter from Birmingham jail is really, in some ways, our founding document. And what's within that founding document is King's intellectual trek that we've just spent the last 10 minutes or so describing. I think it's like one of the most fascinating treks that anybody's been on. And I think it's true. And that's why I wanted to spend so much time with it in the book. I really wanted to delve into it. And I guess that's why we spent so much time on it tonight, too.
Well, it is just such an interesting journey that King takes intellectually, but then also in the book, you get a little more into his intellectual influences, the journey that they took as well. You know, a lot of unexpected connections there. But John, in the Q&A, and here's also my reminder to the audience that if you have questions, or Paul or myself, please drop those into the Q&A and we will get to as many of them as we can. But John asked a very good question, because if we're talking about the importance of this document, the importance of 1963 of Birmingham, but at the time that we're talking about this document is being written, Birmingham was looking awfully a lot like a failure for the SDLC. And so to get that direct action, to have that be effective, you got to have massive numbers of people to actually make a statement, to fill the jails, to do everything that King and the SCLC was trying to do. So John asks, you talked about a point when the effort seemed a possible failure. Only a couple of people showed up for the event. The New York Times left town. What turned people around, and what actually was it that got people re-engaged?
It was the most dramatic and controversial idea that any campaign in the civil rights movement had ever considered. And I don't think there is an idea as dramatic and controversial that's ever been offered since then. James Bevill looked around and he said, well, if the adults aren't going to protest, there's only one group of people left who might protest in Birmingham. And he said, I think against Bull Connor, we should put kids on the front lines, and they should be the ones who will protest. And King was like, you are out of your mind. Nobody thought this was a good idea. But Bevill was not one to be diplomatic, to say the least. There's tons of idiosyncrasies about James Bevill that are fascinating and almost funny in the book. So I want to let readers get to it on their own time. But James Bevill was like, no, I really believe that kids are our only way forward. And so he began to train them and work with them in the way that he had worked with other civil rights activists before Birmingham. And it got to the point where there were dozens and then scores of those kids, and James Bevill would take them out and say, he took them. There's this one anecdote, if I could just share it real quickly. He takes the kids, there's like maybe 20 or 30 of them. He takes them after school, and they don't know how awful Birmingham is. And he's starting to tell them how like all their school supplies are basically the surplus of white schools, the discards of white schools. Their football equipment is discarded and no good. And that's why they have to repaint it from other school colors that are all white high schools. And this just floors these kids. James Bevill takes these kids one day to the cemetery, and he goes, look around. And they do. And he's like, in 40 years, you're going to be here. He goes, now, what are you going to do while you're alive? And he says something to the effect of, you have a chance right now to change your life and the life of your parents and the life of your grandparents. You have a way to change Birmingham in a way that they couldn't and your grandparents couldn't either. And guess what? You have a chance right now to change Birmingham in a way that your kids and your grandkids will benefit. Look around. You're going to be here in 40 years. What do you want to do right now? And these kids were just like, yeah, man, like I want to protest. And so eventually, King never even agreed to put them out there. They just went out there. And what I'll say, and Claire, you've read it, so I'm curious for your thoughts on it. We have this image in our heads put forth by documentaries or maybe other books about like what happened in early May when the dogs were released and the fire hoses were unfurled. But I think when you actually read what happened during Double D-Day, like I'll say that was the hardest chapter for me to write, because it is beyond violent. Did you feel that way?
Oh, certainly. It's beyond violent, and it's also beyond violent towards children, which is just, it's so to imagine like the depths of hatred that it would take to unleash that kind of violence on kids, who are not asking for anything more than equality is just really shocking. But it was so interesting to me that the first D-Day, right, is quite
Yeah,
different.
this early May in
Yeah.
1963 is divided into D-Day and like double D-Day, and then actually they use that language for a reason, right? Because they realize things might get as hairy as something that's looking like a war, right? So anyway, yeah, D-Day, go on.
Yeah, so in D-Day, these are when the children first march, they've been organizing, and I want to make sure we also mention Diane Nash organizing
Yes,
besides James
yes,
Bevill as
yeah.
well. But this organization had been happening with the help of some local media personalities, a really popular local DJ to help get the word out. The first day, it seemed like that the Birmingham police were going to take a page out of Albany's book and have these very gentle arrests happen. I mean, they're still arresting children, but these aren't the fire hoses, these aren't the dogs, right? But then it just all breaks down and it never goes back. It's these extremely violent confrontations. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, even though the civil rights movement leaders were obviously not the ones unleashing the violence on these children, right? They were not, their children walking down the street should never provoke this reaction, right?
Sure.
So it is not their fault. But I wonder, how did they grapple with the fact that they knew that this could happen and that it likely would happen, and that if this happened, this was going to help achieve their goals, but it's happening with people so young. It's a new territory for the movement. Can you talk about how the different leaders grappled with that and where they ultimately landed on that question?
Well, it's thank you for bringing that up, because we should start with this idea that these leaders are not just leaders, these are Christian leaders, these are men of faith. And this act to put kids on the front line, knowing what might happen, other men of faith saw it as something that was like almost beyond sinful, right? Like, and James Bevill thought the kids were ready. He thought, I have trained them. They know how to respond, meaning they know how to duck. They know how to basically like not be violent. That was the main thing. He's like, we cannot resort to violence. If we resort to violence, then we set back ourselves and our brothers and sisters who are willing to be courageous and to just stand back up again, right? So we cannot be violent. But the reality is, and I struggle with this a lot, in that Double D-Day chapter, you will read about an action by Wyatt Walker that is, I don't know if there's another word for it, but immoral, right? Like, he does something during Double D-Day to provoke the violence, knowing that if he does, he can get the sort of gratuitous brutality that the press might want to capture. And so Wyatt Walker, a man of deep faith, right? His dad was a pastor as well. Wyatt Walker's own father read in Hebrew and Greek every day in addition to English, right? Read the Old Testament in its native tongue and read the New Testament in its native tongue, ancient Greek, right? And yet Wyatt Walker is like, we have to do this. This is our moment. And I still wrestle with that decision, because it allows, the reason I think Birmingham is our origin story is because everything that happens after it is in some ways like a response to Birmingham. John F. Kennedy sponsors civil rights legislation in the summer of 1963. And he says, but for Birmingham, we wouldn't be here today. That leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That leads to that leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That leads to King's death in 68. That leads to what I think is a new life for his country. It leads to not only Shirley Chisholm's presidency, but the rise of the Black middle and upper class. And it leads to Barack Obama's presidency. And it leads to, like, we can get to this in a second, but it leads to the life that I'm able to lead today with my wife and my family. And that's really, and I feel like, to bring it back, where does it start? Where do things actually start to turn? And they start to turn with Double D-Day, and a choice that was very hard to make. Wyatt Walker later said something like, we have it in the book, it's something like, what he chose to do was a bitch of a line to draw on America's dust. But he did it. And he was criticized by everybody for doing it. And there are days where I'm like, he shouldn't have done it. And then there are other days I'm like, I'm so glad that he did. And I think it's really just an outgrowth of the violence of that time and what those times demanded of even people who were considered themselves people of faith, to try to bring forth the reality, bring forth the justice that they saw that the nation needed.
There's a question here in the Q&A I want to make sure we get to from Solomon. And Solomon asked, you mentioned egos as forces conflicting and influencing many of the events during the 1960s, from anyone from Bull Connor and his crew to the SCLC. I would add the Kennedys to that, or
Yeah.
Bobby and
Yeah,
John Kennedy.
Yeah, Bobby, there's so much. I mean, if we were saying earlier, like there's so much in this book that we can't discuss in 1 hour. But Bobby Kennedy and then his interactions with King, yeah,
there's something else worthy of many books in themselves, as I'm sure it has inspired. But this question asks, what do you think allowed King to target the unveiling and disruption of those egos to actually move the social justice movement forward? And even though this question mentions Bull Connor and SCLC, I'd love for you to talk about Bobby Kennedy and how that factors into ultimately getting him on the side of the Civil Rights Act, what became the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to answer that. First, within the SCLC, this one of King's most brilliant moves as the leader of the SCLC was to realize how large those egos were, everybody beneath him, and to not try to micromanage them, and to instead try to just try to let them reach their own conclusions about what would be just, guide them to that. And so it was almost like a self-education that was almost like a self-actualization for these deputies. And that in some ways indebted them all the more to King, whom they began to see as something like a teacher as well as a leader. And as a result of that, a lot of the people with these massive egos, James Bevill, Wyatt Walker, Fred Shuttlesworth. I mean, he doesn't play a huge role in this, but like Andrew Young, who would later in the civil rights movement play an outsized role, they stuck with the SCLC when they could have perhaps abandoned it because they were so enchanted with King as a leader. And that was, I think, his real breakthrough. With Bobby Kennedy, it was different because Bobby, and when we think of Bobby today, here's another way in which the persona that we have is not necessarily the reality of the time. We see Bobby Kennedy as almost like this liberal lion, right? This guy who wanted to defend equality, who wanted to push forth real progress in the nation. That was not the reality in 1963. Bobby Kennedy was against, and I cannot say this strongly enough, every possible action that King wanted to take, because he saw every one of King's actions as a threat to Jack's re-election chances in 1964. Bobby was a massive political animal, and more than that, he was Jack's protector, not just the attorney general, Jack's political protector. And there was no way, if Bobby didn't trust King, and he didn't, that he was going to allow Jack to trust King. And so a big part of this book is this battle, again, psychological, between Bobby and King and other members of the SCLC, and Harry Belafonte, who's a name we haven't even brought up yet, but like Harry Belafonte plays a huge role in this book too. And all of these people trying to impress upon Bobby why he should come along and see things the way they do. And it takes numerous meetings for them to do that, and totally like horrendous headlines and footage from Walter Cronkite's evening broadcast. But Bobby ultimately comes around because he sees these kids as not too dissimilar from these kids in like Double D Day is not too dissimilar from his own. He had 8 children at that time. He and his wife Ethel were about to have their 9th child. And something that Harry Belafonte said to him really struck a chord. And from then on, he began to change in ways that altered everything about him. Altered first the way he tried to present civil rights legislation to Jack, and ultimately altered the way that he began to try to govern for the rest of his short life. Birmingham, here again, was another instance in which Birmingham changed everything about America. Birmingham changed Bobby Kennedy. The Bobby Kennedy that history remembers today was also birthed in Birmingham. That was Bobby Kennedy's origin story as well. And the book explores how he moved to that position.
And this is right at the end of the book, but when Bobby Kennedy has that mental shift, it's really interesting because Henry Belafonte and everyone else who was in that meeting come away thinking that was a disaster, right? There's a meeting that was with a lot of Black community leaders at the White House. Bobby Kennedy gets schooled, for lack of a better word, about his understanding of the Black experience in America. And they come away thinking it's dead. This prospect of legislation is dead. And it was that that connection to the kids and the children who were involved in this effort. When we say children, y'all, we're not just talking, this isn't high schoolers only. This is high school, middle school. These are kids who are 8.
Well, you know, James, to put this in perspective, and at a certain point when the SCLC is debating, well, James Bevill, how old, like, what's the cutoff age for anybody? Like, is it for anybody who wants to protest as part of this, your so-called D-Day? He's like, if they're old enough to walk to church, they're old enough to protest. And there were kids as young as 6 that showed up at D-Day and Double D-Day.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our time, but I didn't want to leave tonight without, if you don't mind, a little personal anecdote. I was really moved, speaking of how Bobby Kennedy was moved into his late life for him, unfortunately, because it was cut so short, activism by his children and thinking about the experience of the children. You came to this story and came to this book through thinking about your children, the future that you wanted them to have as well. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how your kids and your family inspired you to come and write this book?
Sure. So I'm white. I'm from rural Iowa. I now live in Connecticut. People have asked me since the book came out in May, how did you end up writing a book about Birmingham, Alabama in 1963? And I said, well, maybe the best way to explain that is my wife is Black. She's from inner city Houston, and we have 3 kids. And after our kids were born, our daughter is now 13. And we have twin boys who are now 12. I wanted to really immerse myself in the Black canon in ways that I hadn't before. And so I began to read, I'd read Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, I'd read Malcolm X, but I really wanted to read a lot more of like what exactly the Black experience is like as a way to explain it to my kids when the time came. So it meant a deep dive into the civil rights movement, among other things. And reading about the civil rights movement, there was a period that I became sort of fascinated by, which was really these 10 weeks in 1963 that were known as Project Confrontation, more colloquially known as the Birmingham Campaign. And I'm like, how come, like, this is obviously the linchpin. It starts it all, but I could not read any book that just focused on that. I'm like, that's kind of weird how no book focuses on that. And I just sort of remained deeply curious for a number of years about the Birmingham Campaign. Well, in June of 2020, so 3 years ago, we were watching television and we saw on CNN this officer in Minneapolis named Derek Chauvin almost playfully grinding his knee into the back of the neck of a Black man named George Floyd. And here's the thing about the George Floyd case. George was from inner city Houston, like my wife Sonia. George grew up in 3rd Ward. Sonia grew up in 5th Ward, which is like the adjacent neighborhood. George was Sonia's age, 46. George had gone to Yates High. Sonia had a lot of friends who went to Yates. Sonia's cousin, in fact, Derek, who also went to Yates High, he knew George back then. He remembered him as the tight end on the Yates High football team that made it to the state championship game. So I say this to you and your audience because when we watched George die, the murder felt almost personal. And because it felt almost personal, we let our kids watch it. And that was the first time we'd ever allowed our kids to see footage of a Black man being killed by law enforcement officials, and that footage being captured by their body cam or by cell phones. And our kids had a really hard time with it, our twin boys in particular. And the questions that they raised devolved pretty quickly from, are all cops racist? No. Are just some cops racist? Why did this happen? Am I inferior? We could see these steps leading down to almost a self-hatred, and we tried to cut it off, but it was hard. And the questions then devolved into how America was awful and they were going to move away from here just as quickly as they could. At one point in that summer, there was not just George Floyd, but there's a Black man from Kenosha, Wisconsin, Jacob Blake. I don't know if you remember this. Jacob Blake walked away from cops in Wisconsin, and he was shot 7 times in the back while his 3 kids screamed from the back of his car. And our twin boys saw that footage too. And our twin son and our son, Walker, he saw it. He ran from the room in tears. He said, "Why do they keep trying to kill us?" And his brother Marshall followed behind him. So the latter half of 2020 was a really hard time. It was a really hard time in our family. And so my wife, Sonia, and I, we were like, well, what can we do to try to buoy them in some way? And this is when I thought about all those books that I'd read and those 10 weeks in 1963 that just fascinated me. Because what Project Confrontation was really about, what this book, my book, is really about, is about perseverance and ingenuity and courage. And above all, I think it's about just hope. Hope at a time when you shouldn't have any hope. And in that way, I wanted the book to be not just like a gripping narrative, but I wanted it to be almost like a guide for how to live for any of us who ever face a situation where we might feel hopeless, as my kids did. And so, if you read the prologue, you'll see at the end of it that I dedicate the book to my kids. This whole book is really an open letter to the kids for how they could be courageous, how they could persevere, how they could have ingenuity, and above all, how they could have hope in their own lives if they would just model their lives off of what these leaders did across these 10 weeks. So that was the real reason I wrote this book. And if nothing else, I hope my kids always keep it near them and call back to it, because it's really for them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's personal, but it just, I think, really underscores the importance of the story that you're writing about, and can help remind us, why we study history generally, if I can go far enough to say that, is to find those moments. And I can't think of a better way to end tonight's conversation, honestly. So we are at the end of our time tonight, everyone. To those in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. You could have been doing a lot of different things with your Tuesday evening, that you chose to spend your time here. And we're so deeply appreciative. Paul, same to you. Thank you so much for making the time tonight, and for writing the book and putting all of that work into it and that research into it, and sharing your thoughts with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. And to everyone out in the audience, I put this in the chat, but I really do mean it. There was so much that we didn't get to talk about tonight. There's so much more in this book. So if you have not yet gotten your copy of the book, it's the title is You Have to Be Prepared to Die Before You Can Begin to Live, by Paul Kix. It's available at Atlanta History Center's museum shop, and we highly encourage you to purchase a copy. We are taking a brief hiatus in the month of July from Author Talks, but we are back with a full schedule of Author Talks at Atlanta History Center starting in August. So I encourage you to visit atlantahistorycenter.com to find more information about those. So once again, thank you to Paul Kix for joining us. Thank you to everyone in the audience, and I hope that everyone has a safe and wonderful evening. Thanks.